So, welcome, dear friends. I'm John, Father John Deere, and welcome to this Beatitude Center Zoom session with our special guest today, Dr. Melanie Harris. And you can find many great upcoming Zooms at beatitudecenter.org. And first, let me ask everyone to mute themselves and to write any questions you have for Melanie in the chat link. I'm hoping Melanie will speak at least for 45 minutes, and then we'll open it up for questions and comments for the remaining 45 minutes, and then we will send out the Zoom link. And so I invite us to begin today with a little prayer and a moment of silence. So, dear friends, let's go ahead and just take a deep breath and relax as we begin to reflect on the great questions of our time, facing Mother Earth and human race and justice, women of color, and all the struggles of the human race. And I invite you into the presence of the God of peace who loves each one of you infinitely and wildly and unconditionally. And let's welcome the risen, nonviolent Jesus here into our hearts and our community and our world, and just take a moment to ask for whatever graces we need to live out the way of the Beatitudes and gospel nonviolence. God of peace, thank you for all the blessings of life and love and peace that you give us. Be with us today and inspire us and bless us as we reflect with our friend Melanie Harris about our global predicament and about the sacred wisdom that we are all one. Disarm us, inspire us, heal us, and strengthen us to do what we can to walk your path of universal love and universal compassion and universal peace and gospel nonviolence, that we might always welcome your reign of peace on earth and do our part to end violence and racism, sexism, war, poverty, and environmental destruction, that we might be faithful followers of the nonviolent Jesus, beatitude peacemakers, your beloved sons and daughters. We ask this mighty blessing in the name of the nonviolent Jesus. Amen. Some of you might remember about a year ago, I had here my friend Larry Rasmussen, who is with us today. And Larry, I'm going to brag about you, was really one of the world's first environmental theologians. That is to say, a theologian reflecting on God and the earth, and from Union Theological. And during that Zoom, his family member, Dr. Melanie Harris, was with us, and we all said, well, we have to have Melanie give us a Zoom. And it's taken a year, and so here she is today. So I'm going to introduce Melanie, but after her presentation, I'm hoping Larry will lead us in a first response and reflection. So again, a big welcome to Dr. Melanie Harris, who is the author of this Orbis book, which is a totally original book, concept and take. Eco-womanism, African-American women and earth-honoring faiths. And so her theme is, well, it's really everything, in my opinion, Melanie. So it's justice for the climate and the environment and creation, but all the struggles of racial, economic, gender justice, but particularly the struggle for women and women of color, and particularly African American women. So it's wonderful to be with you and learn from you and have you teach us to help make these connections. Dr. Melanie Harris is Director of Food, Health, and Ecological Well-Being and Professor of Black Feminist and Womanist Theologies and Environmental Studies, African American Studies, and Theology Studies as a joint consortium at Wake Forest University in North Carolina. She's formerly the Associate Dean of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at Texas Christian University, and does research and scholarship and writing on the areas of religious, social ethics, environmental justice, womanist studies, and African American religious studies. Her other books include Gifts of Virtue, about Alice Walker's writing, and she co-edited the volume Faith, Feminism, and Scholarship. And she's currently writing two books I read, Melanie, on Black interfaith contemplative thought, along with climate and justice, as well as the activism of Harriet Tubman and Fannie Lou Hamer. Melanie Harris has served on a number of boards, including the board of directors of the American Academy of Religion, and co-facilitates teaching and pedagogy workshops with the Wabash Center for Teaching and Learning and Theology and Religion, incorporated with the Lilly Foundation. So, Melanie, it's a great blessing for us to have you here, and I'm so glad you said yes. You know who wants to do a Zoom, but I keep having scheduling problems, is your friend Alice Walker. But she's going to be here with us one of these days. So friends, please join me in giving a big warm welcome live from Winston-Salem, North Carolina, Dr. Melanie Harris. Melanie, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. This is a deep honor, John dear. Thank you for the invitation to be here with all of you. It is such a gift indeed to be able to commune together in nonviolence and in peace. These days, we need more and more peace circles. And so very grateful for the wide circle that this is, not just where we are, but all over our precious planet. Giving thanks for the beautiful prayer and the deep presence of the ancestors that are with us in this space. I want to give thanks indeed to all of the indigenous peoples who have woven their lives and their loves through me and through you. We give thanks so much for the earth beneath us, for soil and water, for energy, for fire, for air in this very deep and present time. And deep thanks to each of you for being willing to come to share love in this moment. I would be remiss if I didn't thank my great parents. I have the gift and honor of having come out of two beautiful biological parents, Naomi Harris, who is a fabulous, powerful woman in Denver, Colorado, Reverend Dr. Naomi Harris, and John Harris, who was an extraordinary man, the first African-American city planner in the city of Denver, Colorado. Over the years, I have been blessed by the Spirit with deep family. And so it gives me great joy to thank my parents, my Santa Fe parents, Dr. Larry Rasmussen and Mom Nyla Rasmussen, for being with me today. It is indeed the echoes of their love and all of their prayers that have woven into me and created a deep imprint for eco-womanism. And so I want to thank them and also thank them for their seeding into my life. It is because of their prayers that I too have a son, John Asante Harris. He's with a babysitter today during this hour so we can stay focused, but really grateful that as a grandchild, he has inherited a lot of wisdom and a lot of love from the Rasmussens and others. I join you in this moment of peace and contemplation in a deep way, and I'm so grateful, John, to you for opening us in prayer as we open into reflection on eco-womanism. Eco-womanism really is an approach to environmental ethics, primarily, a widening voice in environmental justice that begins with a step of noticing. We might actually consider it a contemplative practice itself, in that while it is theory and breaks down into a 7-part method, it is also praxis, literally a way of being and a spiritual path and journey. This noticing of eco-womanism as a beginning step begins not just as a methodological step of honoring experience or noticing experience, but it also invites us to notice Earth as ourselves. Earth of our sacred bodies, earth of our sacred minds, earth of our sacred spirits. and also the sacredness of Earth in each other as interconnected beings. One of the gifts of this oneness, indeed, that is a major theme in the work of so many, including John Deere and so many contemplatives, is this real deep indigenous recognition that we are all one. This sacredness commands a different way of being with each other. In fact, when we are in good, healthy relationship with the earth, we are often in better relationship with each other. And this is where eco-womanism has a unique lens and an important voice, in part because how we relate to earth and how we relate to each other matters. Gleaning processes from earth, lessons and wisdom from earth in terms of how we develop ethical systems, ways of being, guidelines of how to be with one another is key for eco-womanism. It weaves these particular ethical lenses together in order that we might honor earth, in order we might shape and reshape our worldviews and our theologies. For many of us who have been educated in the United States or globally in any kind of colonial frame, we need to be transformed. Many of the frames that we use in environmental movement and generally speaking in our work have been shaped in part by worldviews that disconnect, that fragment, that use hierarchies as a frame. Eco-womanism, by its very nature, corrects this. It gleans earth wisdom from the earth for the sake of those of us doing environmental justice by honoring the theories and the methods, the research, the science of women of African descent. Noting the way that these women understand climate justice work, noting how they strategize, knowing the practical communal care and self-care that's woven into the work of caring for the planet. We note that there are practices and theories that are particularly unique in part because they do pay attention. They notice race and class and gender. They notice difference in ability. They notice the systems that are in place that create climate injustice, as well as the hopeful frames and ideas of how to create climate justice in local and in global communities. So we take, for example, the work of Wangari Maathai and the Green Belt movement, and we examine very closely not just the methodology that she created, the scientific and brilliant mind, but her particular attention to, as the women were working in Kenya and all around the world in planting trees, that what was also being undone were images, negative images of themselves. In the work of coming into community, in the work of digging again into the soil, in the work of coming again into an indigenous way of knowing, they recovered their own agency and voice. This recovery of agency and voice has helped to give birth to new visions for economic justice and ecological justice for many. We consider Alice Walker, the wonderful Pulitzer Prize-winning author of The Color Purple, and a pioneering voice in womanist thought and environmental justice thought as she was writing essays pulling people into the movement as early as the 1960s and 70s, saying essentially in much of her work that it was time to stop quibbling that this was a white issue or not, that this was a human issue, that this was a being issue, that this was an earthling issue, and that everyone ought to be involved. Now, this is particularly important in the work of Alice Walker in terms of her grounding for eco-womanism, in part because Alice Walker was framed by Jim and Jane Crow South. She was raised in Georgia and became into being in part by the powerful work of Martin Luther King Jr. and Fannie Lou Hamer and Ella Baker, and so many working so deeply in the nonviolent fight for freedom. This weaving of nonviolence in Alice Walker's own work comes to fruition in a powerful way in her writings, particularly around environmental justice, but also in terms of a creativity around her religion and her understanding of spirituality. In her writing, she writes very openly and honestly about the dismay and real destitute feeling upon hearing about the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. At the time, she was carrying and with child, and writes about the deep depression and the loss of that child during that particular time. That loss and that grief, what broke open from that in a very important way, was a new birth of a kind of faith, a faith in humankind, a faith in the ability for humans to work together, to breathe together, to live together, to love together, cross-racially, interracially, and in peace. In her writing, she talks a lot about how that place of suffering and despair led her to open up to the divine in a new way. As a Black woman in the South, as someone engaged in some of the most horrific, most terrorizing work of civil rights for voting rights, particularly for Black youth and Black women, it is important to note that Alice Walker did not put aside the category or experience of her race, her class, or her gender, but rather she weaves them into her analysis, her understanding, and her experience of suffering. That even in that moment, her suffering was not her own, but was shared among millions who were mourning King, among even more who were mourning the hope of peace and peace warriors. And also by bringing that kind of contemplative movement and transformation of suffering, she comes into an enlightenment, a deep insight that her suffering, our suffering, is not our own, that our suffering is shared, and that if we can commune in a kind of way to bring us to oneness, we might expand our minds and our spirits in such a way that the suffering itself is transformed. Composting suffering into medicine, healing balm. The contemplative practices that Alice Walker then moved into was not just the singing of Black songs and Black hymns from the civil rights movement, though it is important that Bernice Johnson Reagan's voice was instrumental in this kind of transformation. But it was also the chanting of Buddhist song. It was also the music of Native American flutes. It was also the dancing of many earth-honoring peoples and their faith communities. So by recognizing and by linking arms, even in the midst of suffering and uncertainty, to others who were also suffering, she opened her insight to knowing that the religion and spirituality that she was born with and practiced was not the only one. That in fact, in this sea of oneness, in this deep connection, there were multiple religious practices and spiritualities that availed themselves towards healing. This particular lens that Alice Walker gives then to eco-womanism is central for us living and working in this day, particularly those of us committed to ahisma, nonviolence, because it opens the door for us to think creatively, openly about interfaith and interreligious dialogue for the sake of environmental justice. It is indeed, as Alice Walker says in her writing, time to stop quibbling about doctrinal differences or snags where one religion seems to trump another religion. But for the sake of earth justice, for the sake of climate justice, it is time to create spaces and ways where we might talk and commune one another in one spirit. How do we do that? Some in Christian ethics might say, let's pray. In the name of Jesus, let's pray. And praying is good. But what if there are those who see that Jesus is one, but not the only one? How do we open up Jesus into being the true compassionate Christ, the true heart of God, the true brother? Well, we must consider that Jesus is a brother to many, the Buddha, to Muhammad, to many other traditions, speaking and changing and transforming into each other. For eco-womanism, then, it has become important to recognize that these particular spiritualities, these contemplative practices, not just in the work of Alice Walker or Wangari Maathai, do in fact weave together indigenous, often African indigenous religiosities with Native American religiosities and spiritual traditions, with Christian and Black Christianity, and also with earth-honoring faiths, with Buddhism, and a deep, deep understanding that there is something about the breath, the ruach, the spirit of God within us that is indeed evidence of the sacredness of earth. To see the earth as sacred in another is indeed to see the earth as sacred in the self. So when we scale back and remember this first step, we'll walk back into the method of eco-womanism, beginning with this first step of honoring experience. Imagine yourself, even now, on this path of walking through the 7 steps of the method of eco-womanism, honoring your own experience with and in earth. One of the invitations is to think about an eco-memory, some kind of memory you yourself have with the sacredness of earth. One prompt may lead us to try to remember a time in which you experienced the divine through earth, water in the desert, beautiful snow on the top of mountains, the firmness of ground underneath your feet as you lift one leg to the next peg on a ladder. Whatever that eco memory is sacred and important to dive into. Here, this step echoes narrative theory, whereby we lift up story as a way of having a base from which to glean virtue, values, ethics. It is also very, very similar to the way of Native peoples in being able to start with story in order to recognize all of the holes in the web that create space for other stories. For in many Native cosmologies, it is the case that the very being standing in who we are in the fullness of our story communicates that it is not just us who speaks. Our parents, our loved ones, our teachers, our mentors, our good days, our bad days, speak through our stories. The ancestors, too, speak through our stories very deeply, not just in terms of indigenous understanding of their ancestors spiritually and spiritual benefactors, but our ancestor as earth, that the dirt of ourselves, dust to dust, that the air of ourselves, every water molecule that you've ever had consumed in your body is speaking to through your story. This is eco-memory. From this perspective, then, sharing earth to earth, story to story, is one eco-womanist way of starting with honor. Now, we all come with different social locations. Location, location, location is one of the great mantras that Dr. Larry Rasmussen taught all of his students in methods class at Union Theological Seminary. That there is something very important about context and the location from which we tell our stories and from which we live. Location matters. Social location matters. So that I, as an African American, Cherokee, and Blackfoot woman, come to conversation with you, my journey and eco-memory may incorporate very different elements and understandings of the earth. It is great and important that we all come to the garden, the faith community, the sanctuary, the space of prayer, the protest line. It is very important that we all come together. And as we share eco-memory and eco-story, we find the differences in our earth stories matter. In fact, in some instances, they can create conflict. When I think of my own ancestry, for example, I consider very deeply the racial and complex trauma that is also a part of my life and Black people's lives. I am the descendant of those who came from Mississippi during the Great Migration, descendants of slaves themselves, all the way to Deerfield, Colorado, to intentionally, in resistance and in hope and life, start a Black-only settlement for Black families to begin anew. While the community of Deerfield, Colorado did not last very long, the heart and the spirit, the work, the prayers of those people echo throughout eternity. Their heart and struggle was not only with the rocky earth of Colorado, they also struggled with racism and the absolute presence of white supremacy, not only there, but throughout the country. That struggle, the muscle strength to overcome both isms and also overcome and work with the earth, that strength, that spirituality is what is important for the eco-memory from my story. Now, not everyone with my social location has that same story, and you may not have that same story. But what is unique about your story? Where does it cross the lines and become intentionally nonviolent, intentionally in resistance, intentionally life-giving for people who do not look like you? Where does your earth story and how is your earth story? How do you connect spiritually with the earth to sojourn on this journey of creating justice? Eco-womanism would invite us to pause there, to breathe there, to take a moment to learn there, because whatever that practice is, whatever that theology, whatever that guideline or ethical system, that is strength. That is the medicine that we need for peace and justice in our time. Some may call it anti-racist. Others may call it the work of Christ. Many will understand it simply as being kind. Eco-womanism would call it the depth of spiritual practice, the blood of earth, the way that we unite and connect with each other. The second and third and fourth movement in terms of methodological steps in eco-womanism push us to do a little bit more analysis, to consider very, very deeply using intersectional analysis when we look at our own eco-memory and when we cherish the sacredness of others. It invites us to really take a look at race, class, and gender and how those play out in our own Earth stories. How does racism show up in your environmental justice work? How has sexism shown up in your own experience at environmental justice work? How do you see or have seen or experienced classism, economic injustice, even in your own experience? And how, when we deepen into that, does that open our eyes then to see the exploitation, to see the ways in which the earth suffers, to see the people and humans and children and women who suffer because of the climate injustice? There is something powerful about, yes, locating ourselves at first in the center and then linking intentionally our story to others' stories. And this is not to say there are not stories of joy. There are lots of stories of joy with Earth, and these too are eco-memories and important. And for eco-womanism, people coming from peoples of Earth, coming from peoples of African descent, there is always a paradox. The burden to beauty paradox, as Kimberly Ruffin will say. The triumph and the terror, as Anthony Pinn would say, Black theologian. There is always both, particularly the good, joyful, and also the painful suffering to contend with when we think about eco-memory, when we think about environmental justice, creating space for these paradoxes. What kind of theologies allow there to be enough space for these kinds of paradoxes where we can sit with those who suffer and sit with our own suffering so as to hear what she is saying? What practices in our own lives allow us to sit with the suffering of Earth, the vastness of climate injustice, the time that we have now, so that we might hear and learn from the suffering? Well, eco-womanism is going to suggest that it's time for many of us to slow down. It suggests that there are different ways of doing environmental justice work, even in this time, to invite the voice of earth and tree, to invite the voice of earth and water, to invite all of the elements into our processes of understanding and how to create climate justice. This slowing down at this time, at this moment, just before November of 2024, seems radical. Who has time to slow down and hear Earth? We do. We must. For justice will only come when we listen and hear Earth. Earth in ourselves, earth in each other. There's something important about eco-memory that invites the mind and the spirit into the work of justice. But equally important is the work of opening and reshaping the ear. For, as I mentioned, many of our ears have been tuned to perfect notes, perfection, in terms of a standard that is usually framed by a colonial idea of perfection. Not the What if the ear is newly attuned to hearing earth truly in each other? Yes, we might hear suffering, pain, anger, and we, by listening, also hear earth hope. It is not a perfect sound, but earth has never been absolutely symmetrical about anything. There are all kinds of diversities, species, queer identities in nature, all kinds of sounds and movements. So it is not just the 12 dozen red roses that we might consider as beauty, but the wild flowers and their resilience to overcome. Noticing earth opens our eyes and our ears to hearing beauty differently. The practices that we put in place, contemplative and otherwise, that allow us to hear, allow us to be, allow us to embody eco-womanist spirituality, allow us then again to come into hope, earth hope. These are the practices of the day. These are the peacemakers, tools of this time. The steps of eco-womanism help us to get there. Honor experience and cherish eco-memory, critically reflect on experience, conduct womanist intersectional analysis, critically examine tradition and history, engage in transformation and be willing to be transformed, share in dialogue, and take action for earth justice. Our work, my friends, indeed, is to honor ourselves as sacred earth beings and to honor each other and to develop a new way of hearing pain, suffering, and joy, terror and triumph, burden and beauty. This takes a lot of courage. It takes a lot of forgiveness, a lot of compassion. And my goodness, it takes a lot of the cultivation of peace. It is good for the warrior to go straight into the street and to protest boldly and bravely. And yet, if that warrior comes home from the street alone, with no community, then the true work of peace is not yet done. For the peace we weave our lives into by being earth is communal. It is one. We are one. Mm. Talk about a child who do love Jesus. Here is one. Talk about a child who do love Jesus. Here is one. Talk about a child that do love Jesus. Talk about a child who do love Jesus. Talk about a child who do love Jesus. He is one. Ashe, amen.
Well, thank you so much, Melanie, for your beautiful sharing and testimony and vision. I could listen to you all day. And friends, I'm so glad you all hear that. You know, I consider Melanie Harris one of the great new voices and teachers and theologians of our time, and she's arriving just in time, just when we need her. And so it's a great blessing to hear you, Melanie, and to have you teach us. And I hope you will teach us more as time goes on. Um, there's so much to talk about, and I'm going to ask you some things. But first, I want to ask Larry to reflect with us. So let me find Larry if he's here somewhere on this contraption. And so, friends, I'm going to introduce again our friend, Dr. Larry Rasmussen, who's a family with Melanie and one of the world's first environmental theologians and a mentor of Dr. Melanie Harris and me. Just to reflect with us, Larry, in any ways you want about what Melanie was sharing with us about and echo womanist spirituality, theology, and vision and practice. So, Larry, the floor is yours, and then Melanie, I don't even see where you are now. You can respond to Larry. Okay, Larry, you're very welcome here.
Yeah, thank you so much, John. And I want to be short because I want us all to have a chance to hear Melanie further. Nyla and I begin our day at the breakfast table with a prayer that begins, "We give you thanks for this night of rest and this day of grace." It's always a day of grace when we get to hear from Melanie
Mm-hmm.
and talk with Melanie and spend time with Melanie. And as you heard at the very end of her remarks, there's always a song in it as well, literally. So this is a great pleasure. I just will say a couple of things, John, in response to the topic that you have directed to Melanie and all the rest of your guests. Melanie's underscoring from eco-womanism that Earth is ourselves and we are Earth means, I think, that when we talk about peace on Earth and only think about peace between human beings and don't include peace with Earth, because we are Earth, we truncate it. We have to make peace now with earth, air, fire, and water, and peace with one another if we are to have a chance actually for survival as human beings. But I don't think that, and this is picking up on eco-womanism and what I've learned from Melanie, I don't think that we can exaggerate the depth of Western dualism that says humans here, environment there, or that separates social, both conflict and peace, from environmental peace, because the Western dualism that thinks in terms of humanity and nature as somehow separate also comes from conquest, colonization, commerce, and most Western Christianity with those race, gender, and class hierarchies. So it isn't just a dualism, it's a dualism laced with hierarchies that make for conflict and that don't understand that ours must be a peace with Earth, and not only, we usually talk about it as peace on Earth, as though we were not Earth itself. We're just kind of standing here with Earth as our stage, and then we're getting on with our lives. Okay, that's one response. The second response of maybe three here is to underscore what she has also taught me and what eco-womanism teaches us all, and that is to say, see Earth as sacred. Again, in keeping with our dualisms, we tend to see human life as sacred. We don't, unless we are listening to indigenous peoples, including those in our own background, we don't tend to see land as sacred. It's real estate. We don't tend to see bacteria and microbes as sacred, even though we couldn't live a day without them. We don't tend to view other faiths and traditions that are not our own um, as sacred, as a starting point, whether we're in keeping with them or not. So it's really hard to understand all that is as sacred when we've commodified everything. Because once you make something a commodity, it loses its sacred character. It's for sale, and things you don't sell the sacred as indigenous peoples have tried to tell us for centuries now. So I'll finish with this last appreciation of Melanie and the question that she posed. What practices in our own lives let us sit with the suffering of earth? Let us slow down to hear it. And again, when I say earth, that's a comprehensive category. It includes us. We are earth. Our pastor here is pretty good at saying every time we talk about creation care, she reminds us that first you got to remember that creation cares for you with every breath you take, with every morsel you eat. And then then after you realize this and sat with it for a while, you can talk about how you then in turn care for creation. But to ask, what practices do we have already in our own lives that let us sit with the suffering of earth? Thanks.
Hey, Larry, thank you so much. That's so helpful and also beautiful. Melanie, take some time, unpack any of that however you want.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Larry. Thank you so much. For those of you who don't know, we are really deeply family, like we really, really are.
Melanie, I have to say it, I don't know if you can see it, but yesterday a plaque came from you and John Asante that says, "Grandchildren welcome, parents by appointment." So you need to send John Asante our way, but make an appointment to come as well.
Thank you. Thank you. Many of you all may know that tomorrow is Grandparents' Day. And so it was such a gift to celebrate our John Asante's grandparents and Larry and Nyla. It's been such a joy to have such deep love in our lives. I'm very, very grateful. Deep, deep, deep gratitude for the appreciation, for the weaving of love, and for the teaching. I am so grateful to have been a student of Larry's, in part because the best part of being in Larry's life is Nyla Rasmussen. And so I was so gifted as a student to know the gift of partnership and what love can look like in this very divine, sacred way. To see them both weave so much love into the students and into their own lives and families, but to also see love in action in terms of environmental change and justice is a remarkable gift to us all. So very deeply grateful to you, Nyla, and also to Larry. It's a gift to receive appreciation from your teacher. So I'm very happy to receive this. One of the practices that you've just asked Larry about in sitting with the pain of earth and the contemplative practice that many of us have some way woven into our lives is indeed this practice of prayer. I think for me as a Christian, I have been deeply, deeply encouraged by the practice of Buddhism and Buddhist sitting and meditation. And so my Buddhist practice has informed a lot of my Christian prayer practice. In this kind of mutually enhancing way, for me, Christian practice of prayer and coming into being, coming into voice, there has been something sacred about Buddhist practice of breathing and meditating and the understanding of suffering as a part of life. That's then echoed back into my Christian prayer in a way that disentangles some of the hierarchies and colonial frames of my teaching and understanding of Christianity. All that to say that there is something very important about the transformation that can happen when we sit with the suffering. And so in Buddhist practice and the Doshin tradition, particularly, and Thich Nhat Hanh and many, many others will write about this, that the sitting with suffering of the earth is not just for the sake of being depressed about climate injustice. It's actually not just sit with it, but to allow the wisdom of the suffering to unfold. And so oftentimes the practice of literally sitting with trees or practicing meditation with trees invites me to place my hands, and I learned this actually hiking with Larry and Nyla decades ago, but to place my hands on the tree trunk and to hear it, to feel it breathe. So you just stay with the tree until you can feel the vibration of earth in the tree, until you can sense the oneness between you and the tree. That, for me, is prayer. It is also being able to look at the rings of a tree, to really sense the change and transformation that has happened over the course of that tree's lifetime, to sense and literally take our eye to reading some of the trauma that has happened to trees in that ring, to be able to see that the tree also has experienced trauma. And then for me, particularly as an African-American woman, to recognize the complex racial trauma that is in me as a Black person, and it is in many peoples of color in this particular country and around, invites me to recognize, oh, yes, there is trauma. Yes, there is suffering, but there is also resilience. And so the invitation for us to sit with the suffering, it's important to frame it that it's not just suffering for the sake of suffering, right? In the way that we might consider in a Christian theological frame. It's not just the blood and gore, as Dolores Williams, womanist theologian, will say, of the cross, but it is the resurrection of Jesus. It's the power of the resurrection of Jesus, the literal life that is a total miracle, a starting again, anew, a hope that we also ought to sit with. So again, this is a very important remedy, particularly for those of us who work in climate justice work every day, right? That the reality of the green blues is real. You can, and I can testify, it is possible to get depressed and completely in despair because of how devastating things are. And yet it is our faith, our spiritual practices, our contemplative practices that allow us to not get stuck in the rage, to not get stuck in the hurt, to not get stuck in the suffering, but to, by faith, because we don't see exactly how it's going to work out, by faith, to hope and to recognize that there has been hope before for Earth, there will be hope again. Now, this for me, as a single mom with a 6-year-old who's ready to eat breakfast every morning between 6 and 6:15, is what gets me out of the bed most mornings. One needs hope to keep going, especially in the work of justice that we have. And so, however practical it may be, however mighty and beautiful and laudy it may be, whatever the contemplative practice is that allows you to recognize, yes, the suffering, but also the hope is key. Those count very, very deeply in our walk, in our journey of peace. I would also say, I have to say this because that's so true. If you need hope in the world, I want to invite you to Nyla and Larry's house for Nyla's granola, because Nyla's granola will heal the planet. If you are wondering if peace is available for you, it is. It is. I tell you the truth. It is the love that pours in, the brilliant mind that she is, the wisdom that she carries in her heart that feeds souls. This is how life for me and my family has been restored moment by moment, year by year. So thank you, Nyla.
Thank you, Melanie. Thank you, Larry. Thank you, Nyla. Wow, I could just listen to you all day long. I'm trying to figure out what you're teaching us, or to put it in my stupid kindergarten level thinking, and I think you're offering a spiritual contemplative vision. That's what womanism is. But I also know that you're saying it's a practice. That's so helpful. And that's where I hear your Buddhist roots, that if it's not an actual spiritual practice, this is all baloney. But I guess I want to, personally, I'd love to hear you tell us a little bit more about slowing down, nonviolence, and theology. By that, I mean God. And I was close with Thich Nhat Hanh, and he secretly loved Jesus and God, but he really didn't talk about God, because Buddhism is not a religion and doesn't talk about God. So I wanted to tell you why this is so moving for me. Is yesterday I have a friend visiting, and I live here on the central coast of California, and the fog lifted. So we went whale watching yesterday. Melanie, it was such a profound spiritual experience that I just didn't want to cry, and I was trying to make it a prayer. We were out on this incredible ocean with the mountains behind us, and there's the mother whale and the baby whale, and we followed them for 3 hours. Now, the baby whale touches the mother whale, never is not touching it for the first year or two. From California down to spends the winter in Guatemala, which I think is showing off, where the warmer waters is, and then it comes back to feed in California waters. It was just so touching. We saw at one point we were going through for 30 minutes, a school of 100 dolphins. So, I love your teaching about listening to the earth, but the hope of the earth. I hadn't quite thought about that before, but I certainly experienced it yesterday. The freedom and life of creation in the water. There were a million fish we saw, the whales jumping, the dolphin jumping. Um, and so where is God in all of this? I know that's isn't that the question of theology? And you're a famous, prominent theologian. You're on the board of the American Academy of Religion. Where, so all I can think of is God as creator and God as spirit. But God, you're telling me, also is in women's ways of knowing, which is the sharing of story and the story of the earth. So I wanted to share all that with you and let you respond as you would, but especially about what you're learning about God as we work for climate justice and heal from the hierarchies and the isms and listen to Mother Earth, things like that.
Thank you so much for sharing, John. That's a beautiful image, and we appreciate you sharing so much the beauty of it. I'll invite us maybe to just come into contemplative thought with that sharing, if you don't mind, John, of us all participating in the joy of that moment. There is something central into your question of where is God in that moment. So let me invite each of us to come into that moment of seeing that John shared with us, even in our spiritual imagination. You might close your eyes or you can leave them open, but just allow your heart to be open to this energy between this mama whale and this baby whale. This full, more than a year journey that they do together. And allow your heart to be open to the love that was evoked in John's heart, the devotion to stay with them for 3 hours. Just take a moment to breathe in very deeply this love, whatever energy is coming to you in the hugeness of the whale's body, the bigness of the baby right beside the breathing of the water and the movement. As you exhale, you might just see or sense the waves of the water. I'll just take a moment to notice your own mind and what may be happening in this heart opening, deep seeing. We'll take one more moment to just breathe in very deeply, allowing the energy of this beautiful moment to surround your heart, surround your shoulders, surround your mind. Allow this deep connection between the whales to permeate your entire being. And relaxing, exhaling. You might come back into our present moment, opening your eyes, moving your fingers, moving your toes. So let me invite just a few people to reflect on that practice. What did you hear? What did you sense? What did you see?
So would you like me to call on a few people, Melanie? So friends,
That's great.
if
That's great.
anyone would like to raise your hand and respond to Melanie's question about her guided meditation there. Paulette, were you going to jump in? Yeah, go ahead. I'm going to unmute you, Paulette. There you go.
Um, like Buddhism and really inspires you, Melanie, and many others in this group, and myself too. But Franciscanism is so very much like that also. And I just made a retreat and sat by the waters, and John, it sort of reminded me of that, how the mystery, the vastness, the diversity, the growth, the life beneath the surface of the water. It's almost like each one of us. I practice yoga and am a teacher of it, and I have become just so appreciative of life through the body, when we're called the body of Christ, all together, and each one and everything within us is so interconnected as we are in life, and depends on each other. And when one hurts, the whole body hurts in many ways. Um, it's what John said about the whales, just I was seeing uh, the, uh, the the grandeur and the miniature, the the little blade of grass and the vastness of the stars and the skies. Um, and then that reflected in each one of us. There is no limit to the capacity and the depth and the ways in which God wants to work within each one of us and in us and among us. It's beautiful. Thank you so very much,
Thank you.
John.
Thank you, Paulette. Kate, go ahead. I'll unmute you, or you can unmute. Let me unmute you. And then I'll call on Lisa. Go ahead, Kate.
So,
Real loud. I can't hear you.
oh, Can you hear me now?
It's maybe turn up your volume.
It's up.
Okay.
So I have to say that hearing the story in the first place from you, John, had incredible impact on me. And then hearing Melanie expand on that theme with the waves and it just kept growing and growing and growing. And what I felt, I mean, my first feeling was just pure joy, so much joy. And as I wrote a list of all these things that I experienced, they're all qualities that I associate with God: belonging, inclusion, joy, beauty, light, movement, love, participation. There's nothing that's not there. It's everything.
Hey, thank you. That's beautiful.
Thank
Thank you.
you both. I love the story and I love the commentary and the follow-up, Melanie.
Mhm.
Thank you, Lisa. If you go ahead, Lisa. Thank you, Kate.
Thanks, John, and thank you, Melanie. Yeah, I as I just kind of sat with the imagery and entered in, I had the picture of the mama and the baby whale together, and I just sensed that God is all of it. God is this love energy between the mother and the baby, the love between the baby and mama whale. God is the water and the ocean that's holding them both like a womb, right? So this beautiful love energy, and it's all of it. Um, and that, yeah, that sense of God is God is all of it. So thank you. It was a beautiful just reflection.
Thank you. So
Thank you,
John,
Lisa.
yeah, that practice, and many of us use contemplative practice all the time. I use this particularly in my teaching classroom. Invites a response to your question, where is God? And what is God? And who is God? I believe very deeply that if we can feel and sense, oftentimes through practice, some of the divine, then it opens us up to a non-dual way of being and seeing. So this is exactly how you open up the non-dual, right? Through practice, through contemplation, to signal and cultivate more of this God within. So as if we can just cultivate it just enough to remain in the non-dual long enough, then yes, happy to write you an entire book about God and answering that
Wait,
specific question.
so Melanie, you're giving an answer, but you're really teaching us uh, a whole new way, an eco-womanist way to answer the question, which is not answering the question, giving us an experience of God by entering into a contemplative moment, and then just leaving us with that.
And isn't it good that I did not give it? It
Well,
was there all along.
as a elitist white male
Okay.
used to the old hierarchies,
Yeah.
I want you to write the book and explain.
Yes, yes.
But this is precisely your point about women's ways of knowing and women's stories and listening and earth stories, right?
It is. And I
But
would
can you
say
still
that it,
then tell me who is this God that we all
yeah,
just experienced in your contemplative practice? Or you
yeah.
tell me again, no, John, go back and experience God again.
No, I think this is the gift of Dolores Williams writes about how theologians must be multivocal and must
Okay.
be multilingual. And so it is the gift of the theologian to write the book. And it is also the gift of the theologian to lead us into practice, because some of us learn by experience. Some of us are more moved and transformed to do environmental justice because we feel it. Once you feel the water, regardless of our family connections. I recognize that many of my students, for example, have difficult, challenging relationships with mothers. And so that the mother and baby energy is not necessarily love. That's not necessarily the first thing that comes to mind, but that there's a kind of union of the water holding all, including the boat, including the humans who are watching this scene play out, including the stars, that holding then becomes a kind of sacred oneness that someone can lean into in order to understand this love energy. Yes, it is a women's way of knowing, but it is also deeply indigenous, regardless of gender. It's
Right.
actually kind of post-gender, right? And so it does invite us into a different kind of cosmology. And exactly as you just named, John, it then spikes in us, almost convicts us of the barriers and the hierarchies that are ingrained within us, because those barriers are oftentimes, I find this in myself, that's what resists the non-dual. Wait a minute, I need the construct in order to understand. I need the construct in order, I need the duality in order to understand. Oh, there's my my little son, so I'll take a moment.
We
But
can
that
take a break. We can chat if you need a moment.
oh,
We
okay,
still have
thank you. I'll be right.
10 or 13 minutes left. So everybody, I hope you're enjoying this as much as I am. And I just want to hold on. Yeah. So does anybody have a comment while we're waiting for Melody to return and want to share with us? Or I could call on you. For example, Hope Phillips, any comments or thoughts? You can unmute yourself. Go ahead, Hope.
She's being shy, John.
Shy.
It's actually really wonderful to hear this. It's an affirmation of what we practice on the ground in Africa, all the time with our women and kids. She mentioned the green belt, and we have a very effective process of healing the soil. We have a Korean friend that taught us to dig pits, small holes in the ground in our damaged soil, and layer in ash and brick dust and manure and grasses. And what this does is it creates bowls of microbiological islands. So when we have the torrential rains that feed the Nile River, we don't lose our topsoil. Instead, we retain the water and we let it seep into the ground. And this incredible life bursts from these little bowls of biology that we create on the ground. And my sister-in-law, who is not educated, who she mentioned in Wangari in Kenya, my sister-in-law, who's not educated, took a trip through Nairobi with us to the embassy. So we drove across Kenya, and she saw the difference between a country that cuts all its trees down in desperation for cooking fuel, that's Uganda, and compared it to Kenya, where they preserve the trees. And the government, there's a tension between activists and the government, but in general, the attitude is that trees should be protected. And she went home and started preserving the trees on our 3 acres of land. And now our village comes, when they want to cool off, they come to our farm and sit under the shade of the trees. So this talk was just really wonderful for us, because we're doing this in a very practical grassroots way. And to hear it affirmed in more academic and theological terms has been quite nice. But it really does work. It's amazing how Hope and I walked out. We walked out into our farm. There was a termite mound. We found out that termites aren't pests; they're actually very beneficial to our farm. Even though they would eat all our mulch, the termites would burst forth, and they would fly. They would have a swarm. And then every bird species imaginable in Uganda has 80% of the bird species of Africa. and it's a bird watcher's paradise.
Oh my.
So Hope and I sat in our goat house, hiding from the birds and watching bird after bird after bird, species after species showing up for this swarm of termites. And the reason why they're there is because we're mulching the soil. And we were just it was just a beautiful moment of seeing all these creatures come and congregate around the swarm of termites that we had never noticed before.
Yeah.
And so as I was thinking like what could be a practical punctuation on the end of this talk, and it's like grab your favorite woman and go plant a tree. Right. Right. I can't imagine a better way to memorialize such a beautiful talk. Thank you so much, Melanie.
That's wonderful. I'm so glad. I'm so glad for the joy. That's beautiful. And thank you for the connections. I think that this is the gift of eco-womanism, and this conversation is that it is ongoing. A gift of womanist theology generally is that it's constructive theology. It's always an echo. Yes, there will be writing, and there is writing, and there are ways in which the heart is completely transformed into being able to see things new and to be with earth new. And I think particularly for those modes of resistance in which we feel it within ourselves, that usually in terms of just neurological realities, there are ways in which our brains have actually kind of followed the pattern of education and sometimes our trauma and our experiences. And these can actually be softened by leaning into a kind of spiritual practice. And I think many of us do experience God very deeply in nature, in this kind of mystery, God as mystery, God as vastness, God as earth. So if we can write the theology, it is indeed writing the earth of ourselves. Most of us may not have time to write a dissertation in the mirror every morning, but we can walk through the process of connecting with ourselves. We can walk through the process of affirming ourselves and the earth in ourselves in that reflection in the morning, so as to be able to see, here I am, God the divine. I see you, the divine in me. And to name that, including all the hard parts. So for me as a professor, there is a kind of classist reality that I live into as a part of being a part of the academic reality of what that means to be a professor who is paid at an institution in ways that many of the African Americans in my family are not paid because they don't have the PhD that I have. So recognizing that part too is submerged in this water of compassion and action. And it does mean that when I see myself in the mirror in the morning, I am deeply aware of the economic privilege that I have and the action that is necessitated for me to work for environmental, ecological, economic justice because of how I show up, how the divine shows up in me in the mirror. So yes, that too is the theology. And as we have time for the work that we do, some of us are writers, some of us are clergy, some of us are contemplative leaders, some of us are activists in the work of our hands, that we see our hands as earth, as doing sacred work. And, not so sacred work, because sweeping up Cheerios off the floor is also God, and taking care of loved ones who are maybe not well is also the work of God. Taking care of all of that is also the theology of creation care.
Thank you. So, Rich, and we're coming to the end of our time. Can I ask you one last question? So,
Yeah.
just to say a few words on the clumsy word nonviolence in the middle of all of this. So, that's been a large part of my work and why I'm trying to continue the Beatitude Center for the Nonviolent Jesus, using Gandhi, Kingian, Dorothy Dayin, hermeneutic perspective of nonviolence on the Gospels, therefore life, and seeing creation, literally seeing the whales yesterday, it's so touching and healing because we should all just, it seems to me, every human being, as the indigenous have been saying forever, just be in awe of the wonder of creation and life and the sunrise and so forth. Instead, we're making money and bombing and killing one another in New Mexico, preparing the end of the world at Los Alamos. The homelessness rising, not to mention, of course, racism and sexism, but it's this permanent culture of war on each other, war on Mother Earth, and just going ahead uh, and not responding as the human race needs to the destruction of the planet, the impending catastrophic doom that we're facing. Well, Martin Luther King is saying over and over that clumsy word interconnectedness is the best way to understand the clumsy word nonviolence. And I hear that's what you're talking in a beautiful spiritual kind of interfaith, mystical, ecological, womanist vision. But that means no killing of each other and no destruction of the earth as a fundamental bottom line. What do you think about that, Melanie?
I think that the gift of non-harm is the right way to go. It is the gift of being able to live into peace in every single way. And that is a hard path to take, but it is the path of Christ. I do believe that that's the part of the prescription for us as followers of Jesus, followers of a nonviolent Jesus, so that the essence of compassion ends up becoming this powerful, overarching theological category. And in that compassion is this constant practice of non-harming. And so the non-harming in different relationships, racism, for example, means that the practice of non-harming and nonviolence may look different for BIPOC peoples moving in racial justice ways than it does for white peoples moving in racial justice. For much of the work of anti-racism that I've done in collaboration with white theorists and those who are working on whiteness, there is a total interrogation of the self, of the white self, that has to take place in a completely compassionate way. This is the work of James Baldwin, inviting white people to do their own work themselves. Dr. Jennifer Harvey speaks of this. Larry Rasmussen speaks of this. This work of undoing the work of violence that is a part of the idea of whiteness, that is framed on the paradigm of white supremacy, this undoing of the self, that is the work of non-harming. That's the non-violent work. So that this reflection and seeing oneself, white self, in the mirror and echoing this real deep sense of sacred oneness, this determination to see peace, to be non-harming, is to reject every inner framework, every teaching, every family message, to reject every message that has been and communicates violence. It is to come into a deep, deep level of self-love of the self, deep, deep level, such that one meets the love of God as one is. It is the true nature of coming into the recognition that you are enough. You are enough and you are loved. And this is so crucial, particularly for white people engaged in anti-racist work. You can be so powerful on the environmental justice path, in the work of protest. And if you do not know the sense of peace and nonviolence in your own being, then unfortunately, it perpetuates itself in some way in our culture, because there are lots of temptations to lean into white supremacy. There are lots of ways in which it is seen as normal to do so. So yes, it is a different sense of compassion. It's an unpacking, right, of compassion, into recognizing that in compassion, there is a deep wisdom. And that wisdom is predicated on the fact that you are sacred, period. Anything that communicates, any part of your life and being, any part of your experience that communicates that you are not sacred has to be resisted, let go, released. And in the Black sense, release in the name of Jesus, so that you can come into the full oneness of who you are and who we are. We all are. Only when that self-love is present can we see clearly. And that self-love, that cultivation of true compassion, the strength of compassion, that's what King was talking about. That's the healing. And that one place where we find the source of that love is earth.
Wow. Well, that's a powerful way to end. And you've given us enough to think about for the rest of our lives, Melanie. Wow. Everybody, please join me in giving a great warm thank you to our teacher, Dr. Melanie Harris.
Thank you,
And I
John
hope you
dear, and
will
thank you.
come back some other day and explain all things to us again, because some of us forget. Wow, it
Thank
was so beautiful, Melanie, and very rich and honest, and you have a great gift of teaching. So I thank you all for being here, and I urge you, do you want to get Melanie's book, Echo Womanism for Orbis? That'd be great. Can I make a little commercial, Melanie? So next week, I'm having my friend Father Greg Boyle on to talk with us. It's kind of amazing. You're going to get a chance to meet with the legendary Jesuit priest if you want to talk to him. He's in the Philippines today and coming back just in time to be with us. Greg, as you know, is the founder of Homeboys Industry and the leading, really kind of voice and teacher for a way out of gang violence on the world, the whole world. He's the author of these several New York Times bestselling books, Tattoos on the Heart, Barking to the Choir. I think he's going to be he's talking with us about love in a divided time, and therefore nonviolence, and his lifelong working with gang members. He's lost 150 close friends, and he now has 10,000 former gang members working for homeboys and homegirls in LA. He was last month, President Biden gave him the Presidential Medal of Freedom. Very excited to be with us. I invite you to come, tell your friends, let's get a crowd for Father Greg. He's and then I don't know, Melanie, if you know Dr. Loretta Brown. You do? Wow. So my impression is she's the world's expert on Howard Thurman, and she's doing a Zoom with us in October on her great new book on the lessons of Howard Thurman, who's kind of it, y'all. He was a friend of Mahatma Gandhi and Martin Luther King's mentor, and I've spent the summer reading Howard Thurman. I'm trying to get up to speed to be with Loretta Brown in October. And then in December, we have the head of the International Thomas Merton Society speaking with us on Thomas Merton's writings on global crises. And she, Judith Valenti, is a former correspondent for All Things Considered on NPR and used to be with Religion and Ethics TV and has a big following. And so we're very blessed to have her. In the new year, we're going to have Carrie Kennedy on human rights, Kathy Kelly on war, and many other wonderful other Zooms coming up. So thanks very much, everybody, for listening. Thank you, Larry, for jumping in. Thanks for everybody for your patience. And Melanie, you're terrific. Very,
Thank
very
you, John.
inspiring.
Thank you for the invitation. So good to be with you all. Thank you
Yeah,
so
we'll
much.
do it again sometime, Melanie.
Very good. Thanks,
And are you
everyone.
really writing another book? Are you almost done?
Yes,
I'm
yes,
sorry,
yes.
but because I'm going to have you talk on your book, but I know you're not going to. You're going to make us experience God of the book. And it's just terrific. So God bless everybody. I have to go, so I'm going to sign off. And I thank you all very much. And deep thanks to you, Melanie. We pray for one another, and we go in a spirit of deep joy and gratitude and peace, knowing that we're all deeply loved and we're all one. Peace be with you all. See you
Thank
next time
you.
at the
Thank
Beatitude
you.
Center.
Thank you.
Okay. Bye-bye.